My name is Stephanie. I'm sitting here replaying the events of that fateful night in my mind. The silence that fell over the table after I revealed my true position was deafening. Claire's father's fork hitting his plate softly, her mother's expression losing all warmth, and Daniel's unsettled look. It was a moment that changed everything. I met Lily back in college. We were two young girls with big dreams, sharing instant noodles in our tiny dorm room. We used to talk about our futures, the companies we'd build, and the impact we'd make. But as time went on, Lily got engaged to Mark, and she entered a new world of polished friends and high society events. I became the old friend she tolerated rather than the one she truly valued. Lily's engagement dinner was held at her parents' luxurious mansion. The place was filled with crystal lights and the soft sound of a violin. I almost didn't go. I had a feeling it wouldn't be a pleasant experience. But Lily insisted, saying, "It wouldn't be complete without you." Now, I realize I should have picked up on the tone behind those words. When I arrived, I immediately felt out of place. The other women were wearing designer gowns, while I had on a simple black dress. The men were discussing investments and business expansions, and I just sat there, quietly observing. I've always been more of an observer. Lily introduced me to Mark with a careless smile. "This is Stephanie. She's just an office clerk at some company." Those words, "just an office clerk," hit me hard. A few guests gave me polite nods, the kind you give to someone who's just in the background. I smiled, but inside, I was calculating. What they didn't know was that I had chosen my position strategically. Titles can be distractions, but access to information is real power. I didn't correct her right away. I wanted to see how far she'd go, how much she'd try to shrink me to make herself look better. Dinner was served under the golden chandeliers, and I watched the dynamics at the table like a game of chess. Lily's parents were all over Mark, treating him like royalty. They asked him about his company, his future plans, and the merger he was working on. I kept my head down but my ears open. When I heard the name of his company, my heart didn't skip a beat. I knew it very well. Mark eventually turned to me and asked, "So, Stephanie, what exactly do you do?" Before I could answer, Lily laughed and said, "Oh, she just takes care of paperwork and schedules. You know, the invisible part of the office." That word invisible again. I looked into Mark's eyes for the first time that night, and I saw something in his expression. Was it recognition? Uncertainty? I couldn't tell. I simply said, "I manage operations." It was true, but not the whole truth. Lily rolled her eyes playfully, but her father's hand tightened around his fork. He knew that phrase carried weight in certain business circles. I could feel the atmosphere in the room change. When I mentioned a recent restructuring strategy that had saved a client $5 million, whispers started to spread from the other end of the table. I didn't name the client, I didn't need to. Lily's smile began to fade at the edges. She thought she knew my story because she knew my past, but she'd never bothered to ask about my present. Then, Mark asked me which division I managed. I knew the game had changed. His tone was curious, not mocking like Lily's. I placed my glass down gently and replied, "Global Restructuring and Acquisitions Oversight." Lily blinked and said with a forced laugh, "That sounds too big for an office clerk." I ignored her and kept my eyes on Mark. "It is," I said calmly. He leaned back in his chair and studied me. "Oversight for which company?" he asked. This was the question I'd hoped to avoid, but Lily had pushed me into this corner. I told him the name of the parent group that owned his company. Silence filled the room. It wasn't a dramatic silence, just a heavy one. Lily's father's fork hit his plate, and her mother's face lost all its warmth. Mark didn't look shocked, he looked unsettled. "That's our majority stakeholder," he said slowly. I nodded. "Yes, it is." Lily let out a small scoff, but there was uncertainty in her eyes. I didn't elaborate or boast. I just let the truth sink in. In that room where I'd been called invisible, I saw Mark's posture change. He was remembering meetings, emails, and a name on executive directives, my name. Lily finally broke the silence. "You're joking, right?" she said, but her voice was weak. I turned to her slowly and asked, "Do I look like I'm joking?" Mark spoke before she could respond. "Stephanie Thompson," he said carefully. Hearing my full name from his mouth changed everything. I met his gaze and nodded. Recognition and respect filled his face. "You chaired the emergency board call last quarter," he said. It wasn't a question. Lily's parents exchanged a panicked look. They understood what this meant for Mark's company. I had signed off on the $3 million funding extension that had kept it afloat during a tough transition. I had approved the compliance audit that Mark had struggled with. Lily stared at me like I was a stranger. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. I looked at her steadily and said, "You never asked." The room no longer saw me as just an office clerk. They saw power, influence, and authority. But it didn't feel good. What hurt the most wasn't Lily's laughter or the label of office clerk. It was the realization that someone who once knew my dreams had reduced me to something small for her own convenience. Mark stood up and extended his hand to me. "It's an honor," he said quietly. Lily's smile was completely gone. And as I sat there, I finally understood. I didn't need to prove who I was. I just needed to stop letting others define me.